Hello and welcome to Food for You and the Planet, a fresh new podcast that explores healthy and environmentally sustainable food solutions. This podcast is brought to you by Healthy Plan Eat Online Farmers Market. I'm Dr. Rosemary Ostfeld and I'm your host. Be sure to hit the subscribe button to hear all the latest in healthy and sustainable food with Food for You and the Planet. Today's episode features Abby Barrows, owner and operator of Deer Isle Oyster Company and microplastics research scientist. Abby grew up and currently lives on an island off the coast of Maine. The ocean has been her passion, driving her personal and professional path. She holds a Bachelor of Science from the University of Tasmania and a Master of Philosophy in Human Ecology from the College of the Atlantic. Directing microplastics research since 2012, she initiated the first baseline data map of microplastic pollution distribution in Maine. She concluded her work as the Principal Investigator for the Global Microplastics Initiative with adventure scientists. Through the help of citizen scientists, they compiled one of the largest global data sets on every ocean and continent in the world, enabling a rare glimpse at the extent of plastic contamination in remote, understudied ocean and fresh waters. Her interests are in research, oyster and seaweed farming, field methodology, education, disruptive innovation, and utilizing scientific data to drive policy and legislation to reduce single-use plastic locally and globally. Thanks so much for being here today, Abby.
Thanks for having me.
So how did you become interested in the ocean?
That's a good question. I think that the ocean has just really always been a really big part of my life. I live on an island. My backyard is on a cove. And so I spent a lot of time as a kid just, mucking around on boats and in the mud flats. And, the ocean was never far from, uh, my eyes, basically. And my parents, I'd say my mom had a love of the ocean. She was a sailor and just enjoyed being out in the water and loved swimming. And I think she probably instilled some of that attraction in me. And I think just the more time I spent on the water and in the marine environment, the more I loved it.
Can you tell me a little bit about your career path, including your microplastics research?
Certainly, it's a little unorthodox. Let's see. After graduating from the University of Tasmania, I moved to Papua New Guinea and did a year-long seahorse research project. So I did a lot of field research, and that was sort of my first big foray into it. And it made me really love working in the field. And it's hard work, and you never know what the day is going to hold. But I just really loved the opportunity to be in and on the water. And I did a lot of diving, and that got me pretty jazzed to be a biologist. And I went on to not do more seahorse research, but more sea turtle research after that. I still have such a special place in my heart for seahorses. They're just such crazy little charismatic creatures. Um, but so yeah, I went and worked in Central and South America on sea turtle research projects, both on nesting beaches and juvenile eating zones in Uruguay and in Costa Rica, and just really loved that work. But I realized it was very hard to make make a living being a field research scientist. And so I started to integrate more education into my science, and especially being back here in Maine, there's not a lot of field research opportunities. So I found myself leaving the winter to do field research in warmer climes, and then working with students to do sort of outdoor classroom type work. So sailing up and down the Maine coast and being the educator on board, from working in the local schools and then to working at a local research institute.
How did you make the leap into doing microplastics research, and what were some of the big findings that you discovered?
Yeah, so I was working at a local research institute doing education, and you know, from tiny little kids to high schoolers. And the woman who had been running the research department had decided to move on. And she said, "Hey, I think you'd be great for this job." So I ended up pivoting out of the education department and back into full time field research, which was really focused on water quality. And through the water quality research I was doing, we also had a volunteer water quality monitoring program. But the interesting thing there is that uh, by moving into that research program, as an educator, I had had a student come who had just come back from the Semester at Sea program that's run out of Woods Hole, and she talked about microplastics to my students. And that was my first time I had ever heard about microplastics. I'm like, wait, what are you talking about? And so the research department was like, hey, we should integrate that into our research. So it worked really well that as I pivoted from education into the research department, I was able to explore those questions that I had when I first heard about microplastics. So from there, I really dug deep. This was back in 2012. Um, no one, there's maybe 3 research papers out on microplastics specifically, and there was just so many questions. And so I was uniquely positioned to be able to try to start to answer those locally.
When did you first become interested in aquaculture and how did you start Deer Isle Oyster Company?
Mm. Uh, I don't know if I knew very much about aquaculture growing up. Deer Isle and Stonington, more specifically, is one of the largest lobster landing ports in the country. So the working waterfront and lobster fishing has always been a really big piece of my life just because of the culture here. I also, have spent time on the back of lobster boats, and it's a great way to work really hard but make some good money. And it's a really important part of our community here. And so fisheries has always been something I was very aware of and studied them in school, and um, had an interest in it just because of how it allows us to interact with the water. But I think through doing the water quality work and going to conferences and just hearing a bit about oysters and being like, huh, oysters. I didn't grow up eating them. I didn't really have much interaction with oysters. We sometimes ate them when we were in Tasmania. But the more I learned about oyster aquaculture, the more I became really intrigued. One, because the writing on the wall is that the Gulf of Maine is changing rapidly, and the fisheries that we've had are going to be changing as well. And that's really a big piece of what makes this community this community. And so I thought about aquaculture and how aquaculture could be a supplement or alternative um, to our wild caught fisheries as things change in the Gulf of Maine. And the more I learned about oysters, I'm like, oh my gosh, these are like ecosystem engineers. They do so much for water quality. And so that was also the approach I was saying, like, wow, these animals can do so much to improve local water quality. I had been testing water quality all over the area and being like, wow, there's some places that could really use some localized improvement. And so their filtration really helps clean up those impurities in the water and helps with light penetration and can really just cause an ecosystem to thrive. And so that was the other attraction to me about aquaculture. And so it was this sort of two pieces, the community piece and then the environmental side.
Can you tell me a little bit about where you farm your oysters and what makes that location unique?
Absolutely. I wish you could come and see it. We farm on 3.5 acres using surface culture in Long Cove in Deer Isle. And I was just granted another lease in another cove very close by to Long Cove called Pickering Cove. And we'll be setting that up in this year. Um, and Long Cove is a really unique body of water. It's long, as you can imagine, and it's surrounded by land and a very narrow opening to the open ocean. And so it has this very strong current that comes through the narrows, and it's very tidal. And so the half the cove drains out at low tide, so it's all mud flats. And then that cold, nutrient-rich water comes in when the tide changes. But in the summer, that mud flats have been baking in the sun, and so that becomes very warm water, which causes the oysters to grow very quickly. But also that cold, nutrient-rich water allows them to get fat and plump right up. And so it's this sort of perfect mix of just the geography or hydrography of that cove, and how it creates a really happy, healthy oyster. The other notable thing is that there isn't a lot of freshwater input, and that means that the oysters themselves are very briny. And the cool feature in Long Cove is that about 200 feet from the edge of my farm, so the whole cove is around 25 feet deep, um, in the channel, and then it drains out to flats. But then there's this hole that's 120 feet deep that is so unique for this area. So there's this really deep hole in Long Cove, and I think that has allowed for a lot of different species to thrive. So we have short and long nose sturgeon in there. There's huge lobsters. There's lots of bait fish that come through. There's seals, and so it's just a really interesting feature that I don't know if it how it changes how the oysters taste, but just that there's a lot of dynamicism in the cove.
What are some of the interesting characteristics about the oysters you grow? Like, are there special things about its flavor or, is it something that's recognizable to people who might try them?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the one other thing I love about, well, there's a lot of things I love about oysters, but what I love is that every single oyster farm grows a unique oyster. They're all almost all the same species here in Maine. We all cultivate Crassostrea virginica, or the eastern oyster, but we have the terroir. So, like grapes, wine has a terroir that the grapes are going to have the unique flavor from the rainfall, what side of the mountain slope they're on, what's the geology, what kind of soil they're grown in. All of that contributes to that unique flavor of the grape, and the same principles can be applied to oysters. So I think that having oysters in Long Cove and then having oysters in Pickering Cove, we're going to be able to taste the difference, even though they're like a mile apart, just because of those inputs. And that's a really neat thing about oysters. And that's why it's really fun to try a variety of oysters side by side, just because they are so different, even though they're the same species. But Long Cove grows really good oysters, and that has nothing to do with me. It just has to do with the location. And that farm was sited there back in 1999, I think, and it was a very great spot to put an oyster farm, um, because the oysters have a really briny taste, but they're really clean and sort of bright tasting. And so there's this your first initial slurp is the brine, the liquor that's around the oyster. And then when you bite into it, it's very creamy and just delicious. And then there's that lingering salt finish. So I can nerd out hard on oyster tasting notes, and I just ate a lot of oysters in the last few days, so I'm right there on terms of what the flavor is doing right now.
What do you wish people knew about oysters and aquaculture in general?
Oh, so many things. I think first, that not all aquaculture is created equal. It's pretty hard to have this one term that everything's lumped under. And fish farming is a type of aquaculture, mussel farming is, but they're all not created equally in terms of how they tread on the environment. So I think it's really important for people to do their homework and figure out what feels good for them to purchase and what feels good for them in their waters. And so I think it's unfortunate that we have this one title that all these things fit under, because I think aquaculture can often get a bad name because of the environmental implications of some of the different farming techniques. So that's one thing I think people should have awareness around. Um, the other, I think it's really important for people to understand how magical and important oysters are for the environment. An adult oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water in a day. And so you think about that, historically, they used to reef up and be these huge spots, and they were the ecosystem engineers because they were able to help with that water quality and water clarity that I spoke about. Also, oyster reefs, and even some studies are showing that surface oyster farms can really help protect the coastal zone from erosion because it sort of breaks down the storm surges. So that's also a really important piece for, as sea level rises, to make sure that we're not getting crazy amounts of erosion in our waters, because that causes a lot of mortality because of that water clarity piece. I think it's also not just the ecosystem services that oysters provide. Well, and I'll mention a few others just because they're so cool. Oyster shells themselves are calcium carbonate, right? And calcium carbonate is very basic, and that helps combat ocean acidification. So by putting shells into the water, that can directly help improve um, or help decline ocean acidification in the local waters. And so that helps all the different marine species, because of that juvenile and larval stage is really impacted by ocean acidification and is causing a lot of problems. So there's that piece. Also, oysters are really good for you. It's just like a responsible protein. Um, they're lean, they're not high calories. They have all the omegas and a lot of B12 and your daily dose of magnesium and zinc. And so it's a great thing to eat. And it's also eating down on the food chains, low down on the food chain. So not only are the cultivation of oysters doing a lot for our ecosystem, they're really a healthy thing for us to eat as consumers.
What are some of your favorite ways to eat oysters?
Ooh, I mean, right out of straight out of the water on the boat with an oyster knife. I eat most oysters naked, as they call it. That means no dressing on them, because I feel like it's a great way to be able to taste the depth of the flavor. And eating an oyster, you have that initial liquor, and then when you chew an oyster, it releases the secondary liquor, so the brine that's inside the oyster, and it's just like it's so fun, to slurp them down. It's just a tactile experience as well. So I love just shucking oysters and slurping them down. My daughter really likes fried oysters, so I've been doing more fried oysters. And I just did an event a couple of weeks ago, and we did grilled oysters with like a compound herb butter, and those were really delicious. And so I like the diversity of things you can do with oysters. But yeah, the nothing quite beats the shucking an oyster right out of the water and slipping it.
I understand you've been working to reduce plastic in the oyster farming industry. Can you tell me a little bit about this work?
Yes, this is a massive passion project, and also something I feel like is essential for looking at the future of aquaculture. So since 2021, we have been designing and building and trialing alternative materials for growing oysters. So we're not trying to reinvent how we grow oysters. We're just trying to reinvent the materials that we use to do so. So all oysters are grown in all surface culture oysters are grown in some sort of plastic. Most of it's HDPE, high density polyethylene, um, mesh, and then you have these floats that are also that same material. And just every step of farming, you're growing out in plastic ropes, you have plastic buoys, plastic grow bags, and then a lot of people harvest into plastic bags to sell them to restaurants. And just really being like, wow, this oyster is an amazing creature for the environment, and we are just coating the whole situation in plastic. How can we do better? And so what I've been working on is looking at the most viable materials to do that. And viable in the sense of economic feasibility for farmers, um, access to those materials, and then scalability. This isn't just a little project on the side. I want this to be able to be adopted and taken in by the wider industry because that's the only way we're going to really see change. So we have had so many massive mess ups and lost so many oysters to the cove and things falling apart, and it's been a very humbling process because I'm not a material scientist or a designer, it turns out. But we've really gotten to a point where we're getting something that we feel like will be shelf ready, hopefully by next winter. So we're using the ranch culture style, which is basically this large framework that you slide 4 or 6 bags into that the oysters are in, and that floats on the surface. But there's just been so many challenges and hurdles between just access to materials. We started during the pandemic and there's a lot of supply chain issues, and now we're dealing with tariffs, to just the reality of putting things in the ocean. I mean, it's salt. We get ice in the winter, it's high UV rays, it's corrosive. So there's just so many challenges, and then things grow on everything, and then also you're like running a boat into it sometimes, not intentionally, but like inevitably that's going to happen. So like all it has to hit all these bases for it to work. Um, and that has been quite the journey. But my hope is with this new lease in Pickering Cove, the next cove over from Long Cove, is that we will build that from the ground up. So from the mooring blocks all the way, all the in the water infrastructure, and then the grow bags, all of that will be plastic free.
What are some of the challenges oyster farmers and shellfish growers face, and how can they be addressed?
Mm, there are so many challenges. A lot of that is state specific. Here in Maine, we've struggled with the government in terms of there just not being enough staffing to be able to even process applications for leases, or if you want to make a gear change, just it's this extremely laborious process. Things are now improving. There's more staff. I think it's good to have a rigorous process. I don't think a farm should just be plunked down just anywhere, but it was getting to the point where I had checked all the boxes, and it took me almost 3.5 years to get that lease. I mean, we think about people getting into the business. If it's taking 3.5 years before you can even put a buoy in the water, and then it takes 2 to 4 years to grow an oyster to market size, that's just really not feasible for in terms of like getting into a business. It's a really long term thing. It is farming. You're growing an animal. You're relying on the environment. So that's part of the challenge too. Is yeah, you're growing an animal in the ocean, and there's just so much potential for chaos. And it's like, sure, land-based agriculture is the same in many ways, but there's just that added element of the ocean, and that unknown piece is keeps you on your toes. That's for sure. Um, Other challenges all the with climate change and warming waters, we're seeing different pests and different pressures on the oysters, and pathogens and bacteria and things that really will impact the health of the industry into the future. But I have a lot of faith that oyster farmers are pretty rugged people generally, and also very creative with coming up with solutions. So I have faith that we'll make it as an industry, and that not a one size fits all. And that's also what makes it hard, but that people will figure out what works for their local waters.
What are some of the ways you have worked to increase awareness about oyster farming?
Hmm. I do things like podcasts. um, no, I with working for so many years in education, I have a lot of trouble saying no to anything that would allow me to connect with a different audience. So, I do a lot of lectures. I do a lot of local talks. I connect with a lot of students. Um, and then I also do conferences. I go to conferences and speak at conferences to be able to reach other industry members, and also get feedback and see what other people are doing, and that feels really good. I've also been really lucky to have a lot of media opportunities through either magazine articles. I've made a few documentaries with different folks, and that's just a great way, and done quite a few TV shows as well. It's just a great way to reach people that maybe have never even seen the ocean, and have curiosity, but don't have the ability to have that contact. So I think that's been great, and what I'm looking forward to in the future in terms of getting people switched on about how awesome oysters are for our bodies and the environment are, I'm working on getting my captain's license so I could take people out on the oyster farm and give them firsthand experience of what that looks like.
Is there anything else you'd like to share?
Ooh, I think so a little bit on that note of um, getting out there and seeing where your food comes from, and know your farmers. Think about what sort of materials are being used to grow your food and transport, and demand better. It's 2025. Um, we need to be using materials that are going to make all of these industries possible into the future, and really thinking about you know the culture of convenience is really going to be the death of a healthy environment to grow things in. So just having that awareness, and it's hard as a consumer. Our choices are usually bad or worse in terms of packaging and things like that, and so that's where I feel like there needs to be the bottom up and also the top down approach to changing our materials use.
Thank you so much for joining the podcast today, Abby. It's been awesome to hear about your work, and thank you for being an oyster farmer and microplastics researcher.
Thank you, Rosemary.